Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today. And let me begin by thanking Steve Howard and his wonderful team for the Global Foundation to host these discussions. So I think we all know now, it's been a year that we know that our attention spans tend to suffer in virtual meetings. So I'll try to be, I would say, as short and sharp as possible to elaborate on the concept that has been introduced by Mr. Cox. So it's my great honor to introduce this session. It's a great honor, and it's also, I would say, a great responsibility because I'm facing so many distinguished guests today. It's a great honor also as well because, as it has been mentioned, and I'm working in the private sector, I used to be a policymaker, but I fundamentally believe, based on these two experiences, that the very concept of fair or just transition is going to be one of the crucial elements on the agenda of all the people around this table for the decade to come. And I would like to illustrate that by elaborating on three things that happened in my country and in my continent this year. And I think we can learn a lot from the Australian experience. I don't know if you can learn a lot from the French experience, but at least I'm going to try to give you some examples of things we've learned. And I will start with an anecdote, someone that exists. This person, and sorry, she has a very French name. Her name is Morissette. She's 64. She's an old retiree from Nancy in the east of France. So for those of you who knows their French geography, that's the coal country part of France. And for 2 years, Morissette, she's spending her Saturday afternoon until the COVID crisis make her that impossible because of the lockdown. She's spending her Saturday afternoons in a roundabout just near Nancy. And she's somehow one of the leaders of the Yellow Vests in the east of France. And if you remember well, the Yellow Vest protests started in France with one sparkle, which was the increase of the carbon tax. And in a way, this is a very French epiphany of what fair or just transition means, because by raising a little this carbon tax for very, I would say, good economical and environmental reason, this has made the country enter into a social crisis that was unexperienced in the last decades. So this is a very first thing that happened in my country in the last 18 months. The second thing that happened also in my country under the leadership of the French president, what gathered was what has been called the Citizen Convention of 300 citizens that were chosen random to propose new things to do to the government in order to meet the climate change challenge, both on the adaptation and mitigation side. And this is very interesting because basically all their work has been done on mostly one key thing, which is how to make the transition and the things we need to do socially acceptable for the people living in France. And I think this is, for me, the best definition of what fair or just transition means. It is how to make the transition socially acceptable. And the third thing that happened, not in France, but on the continent at European level this year, is the fact that for the first time, I would say a gathering of countries has decided to create a dedicated financial instrument to address the social transition challenge. In the context of the Green Deal, the European Commission has proposed to create a fair transition fund that is here to finance the transition of the regions in Europe that are going to be affected the most by the transitioning, notably countries at the east part of Europe that will have somehow to close their coal industry. And I think, so these three elements that I wanted to share with you as an introduction are giving flesh to the concept of fair transition, how to make the environmental transition we all need socially acceptable. And why this concept is important, it's basically for two reasons. First, because the transition in itself has strong redistributive effects among the people in one nation. And the redistributive effect is extremely different. It's everyone is facing natural catastrophes, but in a way it's not the same. You're not facing them the same way if you are, I would say, in the upper class or the lower class, or in the lower class of an economy. So I would say the effect of climate change in particular has a redistributive effect per se. Second, the way to answer to the challenge, the reforms that needs to be put into place also have a redistributive impact, and therefore needs to be, I would say, supported by mechanisms, instruments that have the capacity to make the whole transition, I would say, acceptable. And in a way, a fair transition has two components, the transition to more environmentally friendly business models or models of living, and social inclusiveness. But what I think is very important to understand is that it's just not the addition of the two parts. It's really that to understand that one cannot be achieved without the other. And that implies, I would say, everyone to meet the challenge: workers, consumers, societies, and finally investors, as we are. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that. By workers, I mean that a fair transition must ensure that workers in sectors that are transitioning are able to find decent jobs in new sectors, and that they partake in a vibrant social dialogue around these transitions. At consumer level, there is also a role to play, because companies must make products that are compatible with such a transition, meaning that are, I would say, environmentally friendly, but also at an accessible price. There is, I would say, no real interest in producing electric cars that are affordable only for the 1% of the population. And the third, I would say, part of our, I would say, environments that needs to engage into the fair transitions are societies by themselves, because they must ensure that we compensate local communities that are left behind or feel the main brunt of the pain. So I think here, the question that we can ask ourselves, and the question that we have started to ask ourselves at Amundi, is what role do we have as an investor in that field? Because at the end of the day, the fair and just transition agenda is mostly a political question, and I concur in what has been said by one of the previous speakers. I think there's a general tendency in hiding political responsibilities behind the private sector at the moment. So let's be clear, the fair transition is primarily a political question. This being said, it doesn't mean that we do not have things to do on our side as investors in particular. But I think to act, and I will explain a little how we are doing that, to act vis-à-vis the fair transition as an investor, I think we need to achieve three things. And I think this roundtable and the work of the Global Foundation can help massively in that regard. The first thing we need to do is to build consensus on the issue at the end. Collectively, we must, I would say, agree on defining the problem. And I think here there is a very strong challenge, because if on the climate side of the equation, I do believe we are now scientifically, technically equipped to meet the challenge. And for instance, as an investors, I think we have everything we need to integrate the climate change dimension into our investments. When it comes to social questions, I think here the consensus is not that strong, and we lack, I would say, common definitions. To give you an example, it's interesting. At the European level, you might know that we are working at the moment on a green taxonomy. At the moment, the word social doesn't appear once into the green taxonomy of the European Commission, because there is a lack of consensus on what social acceptance of the fair transition means. The second thing we do, apart from building consensus, is to define methodologies. And of course, that derives from that. I think we've made, again, a lot of progress on the climate part of the equation. When it comes to the social side, I think here there is a lot of work that is still needed among our investors community to define what are the proper methodologies to select a company to invest in that we consider is participating to the fair transition. And finally, the third thing we need, and I think this kind of event can probably help, is to devise innovative solutions that bridge the gaps between the world's savings and those fair transition investment needs. I don't think there is a lack of capital. I think the question is how to connect the needs and the capital that is already there. So at Amundi, we've tried to make a little bit of our homework on that field. So we've been working on the fair transition concept for some time now. We've made progress. You will see that before the end of this first quarter, we're going to launch the first Just Transition Fund in the coming months, Just Transition Fund that is going to be focused on European corporates that we are going to select into the portfolios based on a methodology where we try to select companies considering if they are participating to the fair transition. So if I take a very simple example, for instance, it's if coming from, for instance, to a utility, it's not only to define with the company how it's progressively. Oops, sorry. Sheridans, I think you're not unmuted. Thank you very much. So I was just saying that the way we try to select companies, for instance, if you're looking at a utility company that is at the moment, I would say manufacturing some coal, for instance, we're going to look at criteria how this company is progressively going to exit from that, and at the same time, how this company is making sure that the workers are not left behind and that there is investment into human capital to make sure that these people will find a decent job afterwards. So these kind of criteria that can be used. So I think here we all have our homework to be done. Policymakers, of course, but also investors. And so in a way, in this introduction, I would just like to encourage everyone to ask herself or himself the question, how can I, in my activities, participate to a transition that is socially acceptable? I strongly believe that the fair or just transition concept is going to be, again, more and more on the global agenda in the future. And there is, in a way, a little intellectual battle to be fought to impose that concept around the world on the agenda of everyone, policymakers and investors. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you.